why does China want the U.S. and NATO forces to leave? Well, I think it's China's position that it doesn't want any foreign forces on its borders because it considers that to be pressure on its borders and interference in its affairs, especially the fact that these forces are located on the borders of Xinjiang, which is of special interest to the Chinese government. So I think it's a strategic location, and I think China generally takes the position that foreign outsiders shouldn't be involved in this region, that the neighboring states should be taking care of the security. That brings me to the second question. If the Shanghai Cooperation Organization had its own troops, would that be able to provide security in the region? I would say no. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization does conduct military exercises regularly, and each state, or many states with the exception of Uzbekistan, provide some troops. And so they have their own troops. There's not an SCO command. The national troops serve together in anti-terrorist scenarios usually. But the way the organization works, all of the states would have to agree about the nature of the threat, where to put troops. There would have to be agreement from Afghanistan. And so far, there's not been a situation where all of the SCO states have agreed on a security situation. It didn't happen with Georgia, it didn't happen with Kyrgyzstan, and I don't see how they're going to achieve this agreement in the case of Afghanistan. The way the organization works, it requires consensus, and that political consensus does not exist within the organization. So I would say that that's not a very promising avenue.
I think that I agree with. I also intend to don't believe China will unilaterally or bilaterally send troops to that region. One reason is that China is a bystanding observer of 10 years against the war. Perhaps we learn from this a lot. Military is war is not, almost self-defeating ways to deal with. And I guess that China in the future prefer to, through diplomatic means, to keep China's friends and contacts with everyone, governments in capital, factions in the frontier, provincial region, and friendship with some chieftains, and do this kind of things to, to deal with, to assure the stability and security. And China will do utmost to avoid the last resort that they use, military forces. And Soviets experience and American experience shows that the guys there are least capable to be dealt with by arms.
But like the other side, Chinese construction workers were killed behind the insurgents. And
this is an incidental action. This is not a large scale. And you always there is a risk, life is a risk. If you go there, someone killed.
One hand you want to make this investment,
It's actually well, of course, help local people, governments, factions, and regional, authorities to develop their policing activity and so on.
Yeah, I realized I forgot to answer the question about the Taliban. I think it would be interesting to see, to look more carefully at China's approach to different factions inside Afghanistan. There has been some discussion of some effort by China to develop relations with a range of actors inside the country, and I think that confirms Professor Sher's point that China's goal is to have adequate relations with all parties concerned as a hedge against the future. It's not clear which way things are going to go. And so China, being a neighbor and being forever in the region, has to be able to live with whatever happens in the future. And so I think that some of that is going on. My expertise is really on Chinese foreign policy and great power relations. So I'm not focusing so much on the internal dialogue in Afghanistan.
One thing I was very intrigued by on your last slide was the idea of leveraging Pakistan, because in my mind I started drawing a parallel with North Korea. We often talk a lot of times about China leveraging North Korea in terms of the nuclear issue. So I was wondering maybe if you could get into that a little bit more, a comparison and contrast, how you might see the effectiveness of some people claim that China doesn't necessarily leverage North Korea as much as they possibly could. What would you perceive the possibility being, the possible effectiveness perhaps of that option, or the possible feasibility of that option?
I think that's a great question because China is a neighbor of both North Korea and Pakistan. And so what happens in each country is of direct relevance to China. It's not just a strategic game. If North Korea collapses, you have millions of North Koreans coming to China. Pakistan collapses, you have an unstable country with nuclear weapons and the terrorists infiltrating it. And so I think that for this reason, China is cautious in trying to maintain stability and good relations with the partner state while trying to reach regional solutions. I think North Korea is more complicated because it's a long-time socialist ally, and you have a historical, ideological factor play there. Pakistan is more complicated because of the India-Pakistan conflict and China's relations with India. And so there's a balance, many kinds of balances going on in China's mind when it deals with Pakistan. In terms of, one issue I didn't address here is that Afghanistan, to some extent, is a competition between India and Pakistan for influence in the region. And since China has good relations with Pakistan and has had a difficult time with India, it has reason to stay closer to Pakistan, even though some of the problems in Pakistan adversely harm Chinese interests. But I think what will really change is to the extent to which Pakistan really begins to pose a security threat to Xinjiang. As you know, we saw that when this incident took place recently, the Chinese government was very clear where the responsibility lay, and that was a change. And if we're going to see more incidents like that, I think it's going to be difficult for Pakistan and China. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a more complicated. There are more issues involved than in the nuclear issue in North Korea. But it's an interesting parallel.
I think if you look at the present approach, China deal with Pakistan and North Korea, general say, China no longer use any leveraging in past and against North Korea. And secondly, the China never, Pakistan, every Chinese know that, is a much better, much lower ally for the China than North Korea. And also, I think that it's unimaginable when U.S. played Pakistan very much, China will help U.S. trade. And what China can do is to, through private and behind the work, to persuade both sides to mitigate their conflict disagreements and to get some agreement within disagreement. I think that of course, in many issues, many threats, the difference between China and the United States is not difference in terms of interest. It's difference in terms of approach and the manner. China believe much more about persuasion and discussion and treat your friends friendly and always take some thankful attitude toward your allies.
I think, I forget who it was, but I think there was a Chinese official who once said that Pakistan is like China's Israel, in a sense that no matter what they do wrong, China will back Pakistan. But I guess the points that you're also raising, I think will also then test that relationship going in the future.
More accurate explanation is that whatever they do wrong, we will not accuse them.
Will not accuse. Okay. Okay. But you also mentioned that the principal policy of having, let's say, foreign troops in bordering regions of China, and with so many troops in Afghanistan, I guess there's a dilemma there. It was even with a paper that Hillary Clinton wrote recently in Foreign Policy magazine, saying that the US should shift from the Middle East and then refocus their energies towards the Asia Pacific region. So basically, okay, you don't want them to be there for a long time, but it doesn't mean that US presence declining from Afghanistan means that it declines from, let's say, China's core interest regions. So I think in that sense, China is always then facing that dilemma, especially with the United States, because just because they withdraw from Afghanistan, it actually brings them closer to China's borders, and where there are even, let's say, more disputes around the South China Sea and so forth. And we just saw, even recently, with the defense secretary making tours in the region. So I think for a long time, there will be this dilemma for China in terms of not wanting foreign troops to be in that region, but where the US simply shifts focus. But again, no matter where it shifts its focus, China and the US are always having to face one another.
That's a very good point. But these troops that are being withdrawn are going home. It's not going to be put somewhere else.
Sure.
It's not sustainable economically.
I believe that sometimes I think China companies not think that the U.S. military presence around China and afraid of their maybe someday invading China. I think that more and more, and sometimes China doubts that the U.S. armed forces there will spoil the cities, spoil the situation of Afghanistan. And if the U.S. take a very militant approach in peninsula, will make things peninsula become more dangerous. So therefore, and indirectly made China's security environment more dangerous. And this is also, of course, and this is also maybe additional elements for Chinese leaders think about the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Yeah, on Pakistan as China's Israel, I think it relates to the previous question about what's the difference between Pakistan and North Korea. Pakistan is a very decentralized state, and that's the kind of the problem that the United States has with Pakistan also, that we talk to one set of people, but the other set of people know where Bin Laden is. I mean, I think that's the difficulty that China will face also in trying to, China can't criticize, but probably the people that China is dealing with are not the people causing the problems. And so it's a very difficult situation to deal with. North Korea is much more centralized, but they're also, have different goals and are less, are less susceptible to pressure in some ways.
In North Korea, we only can make one brand. He refused to be brand. We have no brand. Pakistan, we can make a brand with all the
Well, almost everyone, but what about those who support, those in the intelligence forces who support terrorists?
Very complicated.
Yes.
They support terrorists. So what kind of terrorists? They support terrorists against China. I think that China will. Pakistan country aides up to now never support UN of China. They support UN. Of course, we are displeased. We will proceed, but we will not strike.
Thanks for the lecture. I'm the sophomore from Beijing Foreign Studies University. And just you have said Russia is not very pleased about the new role of China in Central Asia. But recently, Putin, the Prime Minister in Russia now, said to Xi Jinping the future president in China, and he said Russia will support China at any time and under any situation. I mean that. So what do you think about, just now the gentleman has said America maybe have a shift focused from Middle East to China. And so I have also asked a question to Ambassador Wu Jiahui because he has made a lecture to BRCU last month, and he said actually there's no shift. And so I want to ask you, if there has a shift, what do you think about Russia and China, what they will do? Because Xi Jinping and Putin, they are the future leader in Russia and China. So it sounds that China and Russia has a promised future. So what do you think about it? Thank you.
Well, I think you're right. On paper, Russia and China, and in their statements, they always say that they agree they have a strategic partnership and that they have common strategic priorities. But I think when you look at what actually happens on the ground, sometimes you have a different situation. So when you look in Central Asia, at the activities of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, one reason why it has not developed into a multilateral economic organization is because China and Russia have different ideas about this. China's idea is that the more you integrate the region, the better it will be in terms of stability and prosperity, and it's good for China, it's good for Central Asia. Russia's idea is that if this happens, it's good for China, not for Russia. And so Russia has been opposed to creating a bank within the SCO to promote projects because it feels that this would only increase China's influence at Russia's expense. Of course, if Russia provided money to this bank, it would balance the contributions between Russia and China, because now China just contributes money on its own and Russia doesn't. So this is one, maybe Russia's not looking at this clearly. But in general, Russia is trying to create its own free trade zone in Central Asia, excluding China. It's created a customs union that Kyrgyzstan will join, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan has already joined, but not China. And China had hoped to create a free trade zone within the SCO. So I think I don't think that I think they mostly have many common ideas. If you look at what Chinese and Russian representatives at the UN say, for example, we have much in common. If you look at Russia's position on Taiwan or China's position on Chechnya, you see a lot in common. But in certain areas, like Central Asia, I think some of the oil negotiations, you see differences. So just like any partnership, you're going to have differences of opinions. What about the shift in U.S. policy? I think, first of all, Afghanistan is part of Asia. So I don't know, where is the Middle East in Hillary Clinton's worldview? I'm not sure. But I think that maybe her article is reflecting the fact that we're no longer going to be focusing perhaps exclusively on the Middle East the way we have for the past decade, where so much of U.S. resources has been concentrated in Iraq, for example, and not really been spread around the world to a more desirable extent. So I don't think that the purpose of this refocusing is to pressure China. I think it's to have a more balanced U.S. foreign policy that would engage a wider range of states. How China interprets these actions is up to China also. But I think that there are different regional conflicts that might come into play, but the U.S. also wants to engage China as well as Russia. So I don't think that there's some kind of axis that's going to develop between China and Russia against the U.S. I think both, if you look at trade, the U.S. and China have a huge interest in maintaining a trade relationship. Russia and the United States also have very many common interests that we're trying to pursue. So I don't think that there's going to be some kind of new China-Russia axis developing.
Afghanistan was indeed very important in history, and the main reason lies in geopolitics. For instance, the Cold War has already and forever gone, and we have entered the period of globalization. Do you think Afghanistan is still as important as it was in history? And if so, will you show us some reasons beyond geopolitics? And my second question is, although we have entered a period of globalization and interdependence, there are still many people view everything in what arena through the view of geopolitics. For example, many Chinese believe that the military presence of the United States in Afghanistan is a serious threat to China's security. And so how will you comment on such point of view? And to what extent the view of geopolitics is still a proper and useful perspective to analyze world politics? And maybe, Professor, you can also make your comment since you are a state counselor of our country.
I think that geopolitics is forever, and we live in Earth, and we are different national states. And I think that the geopolitics are forever. And but of course, geopolitics in this era, globalization and other efforts have, of course, maybe relatively declined impacts. Also, its form can be changed. But I don't think that globalization or geopolitics can be very useful if we're not to consider concrete situations. United States, China, as well as Russia facing this region. And China concerned with, radical and militant extremists against China's security and border regions boundary integration. Whether globalization or geopolitics, it's always there. And the U.S. want to make a wrap up and withdraw its soldiers from the country of the United States. At the same time, not to last 10 years efforts, just as the West, to keep credibility, orientation, Pakistan, of course. So these are concrete, the interests. And I think that in this respect, globalization and geopolitics, and especially globalization, and general talk is not so helpful. And we can, we have to deal with concrete issues.
In the United States, your question is usually posed in this way. Is there a new great game? I don't know if you've heard that term, the great game, which referred to the competition among regional powers in the 19th century in Afghanistan. And to my mind, this is a misplaced comparison. Because I think Professor Scher is right. Geopolitics have changed. For one thing, in the players that are involved now in Afghanistan are from the region, not outsiders, European countries coming in, like England in the 19th century. You have countries that are there and have a regional interest involved. And also, I think that globalization has changed the environment because the problems that are so difficult to resolve in Afghanistan are all problems of globalization. Terrorism, narcotics trafficking, these are the problems of the 21st century that states cannot control by themselves. And so geopolitical...
But states are always, Asian countries also cannot control drugs.
Well, that's true. That's true, but terrorism has also been around for centuries.
More,
But I think that in the 21st century, we're more aware of these kinds of problems and the limits to state power. That military force cannot alone resolve these problems. So I think that there are conflicting state interests, but I think they're on the background of this globalized security environment. And that's what makes it much harder to solve the problems of this region, because no state in the United States with all of its military power cannot use it to solve the problems of Afghanistan alone.
In 2009, after the Xinjiang riots, I think Al-Qaeda in North Africa issued a warning to China saying it would be subject to future attacks. So I'm wondering how much are global terrorist networks and networks in Afghanistan and Pakistan prioritizing China as a major target, where you might see attempts at large-scale attacks, as opposed to things that the attacks in Xinjiang seem to be more small-scale, or maybe are they just kind of one-off events and not a part of a concerted campaign against China? Are they prioritizing China, or is it not the main priority or a large priority?
Well, I think you have to. I mean, that statement was. I remember that statement. That was a warning that because there were tensions inside Xinjiang between Uyghurs, Muslim Uyghurs, and Han Chinese, and the people in the Muslim world viewing these were quite upset about it at the time. But I think there's a local security problem inside of Xinjiang, and then there's the global terrorist situation. The Chinese leadership, when it approaches this problem, tends to link the two. That these are one and the same problem. But many experts believe that the problems inside Xinjiang reflect the social tensions in that province that have little to do with global terrorism. And then, but there have been incidents of Uyghurs who have gone to other countries for terrorist training and then come back to Xinjiang. That's what the incident I was talking about. And the fear that the Chinese government has is that if the border is not controlled, it will be more of a problem. But generally speaking, I think there's a distinction. China is not a target of terrorist attacks in the same way that U.S. interests are. That what Professor Schur was suggesting is that if China put troops, for example, in a Muslim country, this would create a different situation where China might be a target. Just like when U.S. troops entered Iraq, then they became a target for Al-Qaeda inside Iraq. In there, it might not have been this target. So I think there are different types of security problems that China faces inside Xinjiang and globally.
Backtracking off of our friend's question over here, as China eventually in the future will make the leap from developing to developed, and obviously I mean this is a very large time frame we're looking at, but in that time, do you think it's possible that it will eventually encounter global terrorism networks? Because as you said, all of its influences in Afghanistan and Tajikistan and all these areas, it seems to be a very heavily vested interest in resources. A lot of resources that eventually are going to China, but not to those countries, which people could use, or, you know, as you very adequately put, the major players in those countries or the actors would use as a terms against China or something like that. As China eventually grabs more economic might, what will its future be with things like global terrorism or drug trafficking? It's going to have to confront them, but when and how?
That's an interesting question because China's a developing country and has, for most of its history, been on the side of developing countries in the United Nations and other venues. But China is the world's second largest economy, and yet a socialist state also. And so how do you square those circles? Is China going to be seen as a part of the global capitalist economy? And what will that mean for its relations in general with developing countries and forces inside them that will be opposed to global capitalism? And it seems crazy considering China's ideology, but I think that, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. Is China going to be seen as a part of the status quo of capitalism? But I think that one of the grievances Al-Qaeda has with the U.S. is this issue of U.S. supposed domination of the capitalist economy. Well, anyone who goes to the U.S. these days will That's not quite true anymore. But China also has its own view of the way it wants to play a role in the global economy and has its own interests that are separate from those of the U.S. So I think it's hard to lump together China and the U.S. in the same category. But certainly Chinese overseas workers have been faced with many difficult situations. Oil workers in Africa, as well as railway workers in Afghanistan. So as China becomes more of a global player, it will face more and more difficult situations. You have to China's public diplomacy to try to explain all of these different angles of China's policies.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question? You're still here. What do you think China should do about Afghanistan's security situation? Should China just bring troops into Afghanistan? Should it cooperate with any regional security force? How would you feel about that?
Well, you said it doesn't supply a lot of aid. Most of the aid, okay, let's say apart from the US, India's providing a lot of aid. So how about increasing aid? And looking at those aspects, I mean, it's investing a lot, you said, largest investor. But then maybe in terms of boosting security, aid is the way maybe to do it, military aid. Not necessarily supplying, I don't know, weapons or whatever, but working with the Afghanistan security sector. I mean, it's something which happens a lot in Africa with, let's say, with peacekeeping, with post-conflict reconstruction and development efforts, where you have cooperation amongst governments in trying to boost a country's security sector, which has gone through some kind of a civil war, and you try to build up their police forces, their military, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a possible strategy that China could use.
We look at China's long history and found two, type of response. Some dynasty, or during some periods of dynasty, some emperors, if the powerful, we have great chaos and exploration. But most of them are failed. And another part is that to do prudent, and you only find those ability, which is directly threat empire's security, you make some very selective exploration. Otherwise, you deal with things by a different approach. Sometimes you should tolerate some instability along your canal. And I think that the more great dynasties, more successful emperors, and take second approach. I think that in practical future, the Chinese government will take something roughly similar with the second approach. And we use such kind of conflict. Sometimes this lack of ability along our part. We coexisted with this kind of situation so many years. And generally, most of the rulers deal with it with some, you can say, complex strategy.
Have you solved the problem of Afghanistan?
I think our Chinese, sometimes I think this is a philosophical difference. Since progressive age, since enlightenment, and Western people, or some of Western people, often think things, solution, solved. Sometimes something cannot be solved. You still have to coexist with it, to reduce its threats, and sometimes to transform it into some benefits. And I think maybe because the Chinese have, very long history. Maybe Chinese are more easy to deal, to accept that something you have to deal with forever, and because it cannot be solved.
I think the Obama administration has reached that
Yeah.
point of view about Afghanistan, that there's never going to be a point where President Obama stands on a base and says, mission accomplished. That's not going to happen.
Every nation's capability is very limited. And they are different people. And how can you suppose? We know, their situation, their culture, and the best strategy very complete. And not necessary. And I think that the containment is good thing. And the purpose is only contain your threat, against your nation. But it's not necessary, for us, for anyone, have to be destroyed the threat, then you will be safe.
Well, but that's been the discussion inside the U.S. now that Osama bin Laden is dead. What is the purpose for our intervention in Afghanistan? A lot of people have been asking that question, because that was one of the main goals originally, was to find and capture Osama bin Laden. That's been achieved. Of course, the organization is not hierarchical. There are plenty of people who will carry on the work of Al-Qaeda without him. But that's definitely been part of the internal discussions in the U.S. because it's really necessary and that's. And I think what the Obama administration has come to the conclusion of is that we'll never have a perfect solution in Afghanistan, and we just have to find something we can all live with that won't be a major security threat to us or to the neighbors, and will allow the country to develop in a way where it won't come back with a new security threat down the road, the way I think happened in the 1980s and 1990s. And so that's why I think the U.S. is looking to engage China and Russia and other players to try to make sure that the countries that are in the region have a stake in the stability of Afghanistan, because they're the ones who are mostly affected by it.
Sometimes I guess the Chinese leaders are very pride. And Hu Jintao would like to say to them, we know our right to more in Afghanistan more than you because we are Chinese. Our interest. We have to deal with. Russian Empire have not solved. British Empire have not solved. Maybe American Empire have not solved. I don't think that Chinese and they themselves have not solved. And we should be resistant with the situation and do our limited capability to make it better for them and for ourselves.
So if the situation in Afghanistan will not get better and be worse, so the United States inside maybe will consider not to destroy that military, and then if Obama will not be reelected as an active term of president, so it may be the Republic president, do you think will invite China? Because China also facing a security problem at present. Do you think the United States can invite China to sign the armies to cooperate?
Well, this is a time of leadership change for China too, and I don't think anyone is going to propose intervention in Afghanistan at this time in Chinese politics. I think that would be a bad idea for anyone hoping to have a top position of leadership. So I think that that's not likely to come. That kind of initiative is not likely to come from the Chinese side. If you look at the timetable, the U.S. elections are coming up before the deadline for the withdrawal of forces. So there's not going to be a complete withdrawal before the U.S. election. Of course, the pace of withdrawal depends on the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. It will be faster if things are better. It might be slower if things are worse. And that is to some extent a political issue in the United States, but I think the main issue in the United States is the economy. Most Americans are not very concerned about foreign policy. They're much more concerned about the economy. And so that's really what President Obama has to deal with. But they're related because we spend so much money in Afghanistan.
I have a question just related to Councilor Shi's point about the philosophical difference between China and America. Chinese supposedly accept more of the living to accepting the problems to live
This is the exaggeration.
Right.
General, roughly speaking,
roughly speaking.
we also have idealists. We also have, those people believe very much about technology. But general, we Chinese nation, and maybe historical making something
So,
more than Western.
so if we were to look at why America went into Afghanistan, I would argue that probably one of the main reasons was because of 9/11. We lost a lot of men and women in our War Center. So if that situation were, God forbid, happened somewhat to China, how would China react? I mean, could we really say that America did it and the American public went into Afghanistan because we really wanted to do nation building without any other reason? Or what would China do in this circumstance?
I think I want to refer to a very famous and historian's article in the United States, shortly after those, September 11th. But of course, this article is so unpopular, attacked by many. He said, look at the Europeans in history, look at the Chinese, look at the Russians. They suffered this kind of even much, much more tragedy and much, much more times. The Americans are, maybe the God's favorite sons and daughters. And we are so susceptible. And so thinking that, and for other nations, this kind of attack, although extremely brutal and tragic, but not so huge things. And so he said it as early as 2002. He guessed that Americans, he's a famous historian, he knows a lot. Americans might make some effort in some way. I think he made a right approach. Of course, and generally speaking, I think that China's response to such kind of events will be a little less strong. Because we, as a nation, live in this kind of situation. Of course, not necessarily parallel, but suffering, die, and totally unjustified attack many times. We will not, in the future, I think that we will not send troops to thousands of miles, and not only one place, but 2 or 3. I think that because any Chinese future leaders, at least they will know something about since about Confucius. And generally, China have less possibility. China will do more, have more possibility to do less than required, but have less possibility to do much more than required.
So why are you building an aircraft carrier then? You're not planning to protect the power abroad?
We have 1.3 billion people, and we have so long sea coast. And we just buy a Russian wasted aircraft carrier and a makeshift, so not so exaggerated. And China, 1.3 billion people, and so long sea coast. And if China even have 5, and it's still, the United States shall not make access to it.
Well, but it's also the issue of Chinese nationalism and the importance of
Seems like the national China, of course, population is rising, but when Chinese 1.3 people want to have one aircraft carrier, and this is not national.
No,
Their nationalism have other expressions.
But if you think back to 1999 when there was the accidental attack on the mission of the Chinese
I
embassy
think
in
that, of
Galway,
course, the
there was
nationalism
a
is
strong
so
reaction.
complicated things. But when 3 Chinese cities are bombed, everything bombed, and people make some, response, and sometimes disorder. And this is very not so big things. And China, I already said, and in China, almost me, and first point out in very early times, populist nationalism is rising, and which is generally damage to China's foreign policy conduct, but still, and we should not exactly. And this nation have the limitations, but not necessarily this or that. And it's that. For example, when China public until we passed and looking down upon our neighbors, this is not good. And so, yes, transactions, but up to now, we have only one act to carry this in other nations.
To answer your question also, I mean, President Bush was an idealist. I mean, you have to keep that in mind, that he had a vision of a world that he wanted to well, I'm not saying that the nation building wasn't the immediate reason. It was the first time the U.S. was attacked on its own soil since Pearl Harbor since 1941. So the U.S. that's how the U.S. interpreted it, that we had to respond to that attack. And then the rationales changed. Why were we fighting in Afghanistan? Was it to find bin Laden? Was it to build democracy? What was the purpose? And then we forgot about all that and we moved over to Iraq. And so I think there are many different reasons behind the U.S. actions, but it led to a chain of events where here we are still, 10 years later, and what is the goal? And so President Obama was trying to refocus the goal more narrowly to something that's possibly achievable, where you have Afghanistan in control of its own future, and the U.S. in Afghanistan that would not pose a threat to the U.S. or to its neighbors.
I think we already have 2 hours of very food, including lecture, a professor, and a very vivid discussion. And I think that it's really, I personally think that it's one of the most successful this kind of activity held in our school. And I think that first of all, professor, and then every one of us, make this activity, this session, as very successful and learning and expression. Which anyway, and I think I had already deepened our understanding of this very exciting and very significant topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.